She didn't know why her home country was called the Queendoms. Yes, technically it had queens, quite a few of them in fact. There were the three great queens, one ant, one wasp, one bee, and there were the smaller queens who ruled over the smaller colonies of all species. Still, the queens did not dominate the rest of society, as outsiders seem to believe. In fact, by the standards of freedom every other culture seems so insistent on valuing for some reason none of her people could understand, the queens might have it worst out of them all. At the moment of their first pregnancy, they were locked from the depths of the colonies, none but the three great ever to see the outside world again, assuming no massive disasters. She did not pity them for this, for it was necessary to ensure they could rule in safety and, more importantly, give birth in safety. It was their role, given to them upon birth and important to maintain throughout life. It was how all life in the queendoms worked. Some were born to work, some were born to find, some were born to scout, some were born to maintain, and some were born to defend. Since she had been born to do the latter, she, of course, was put into the army. Unfortunately, something seemed to have been slightly wrong with her, for as she aged it was assumed that she would establish what role in the army she served best. But she hadn't. They couldn't decide what to do with her well after she should have been given her own life role. On a less important note, she should have been given a name before. If that were the case, she might not have been at the gate of the city of all nations, giving the gatekeeper the name of her misnamed country, and even if she were, she definitely wouldn't have found it impossible to answer when said keeper asked her for her name. "I have not been assigned one," she responded, ashamed that the beetle now knew she had no place. Rather than sympathetic or judgmental, he merely looked confused. He. That was a pronoun she hadn't heard since her education days, even though her colony spoke exclusively in the Mancer's tongue for verbal communication. It sounded weird in her head. Their queen had had males within her lifetime, that had to have been the case, but she still never heard anyone talk about them. It made her wonder once more why they had chosen her to get this next one for the colony. "Could you explain that again?" the beetle asked. It took her a few seconds to understand the beetle's confusion. Of course, she thought, they went over this in our education on foreigners. Others are given names at birth, names that have nothing to do with their role in life. The idea did not make sense to her. Luckily for her, another beetle had noticed the predicament and hurried over to explain queendom culture to the first beetle. This is a waste of time, she thought. How am I going to find the male in time? A male's role in the queendoms was something the nurses always found difficult to explain. They usually left between larvae and adulthood, doing what they wanted until they became fertile, at which point soldiers would be sent to retrieve him so he could mate with the queen. Supposedly an outsider had once claimed that the debates over which colony should receive the next male were the only time those in the queendom showed selfishness, but she wasn't interested in the opinions of outsiders. She, as any good citizen of the queendoms, was interested only in how she could serve. If the army couldn't figure that out for certain, then she would serve them on whatever random task they assigned her until they could. "Of course, miss. You may enter." She was somewhat confused by this whole system. Although the queendoms had far more rigorous standards and protocols for deciding when foreigners may enter and leave their lands, she had always been told that the city of all nations never forbid anyone. Supposedly it was one of their greatest weaknesses. One of those sick things that happened when individuals demanded their rights, because foreigners were so conceited as to believe simply being born meant the rest of the world had a duty to them and not the other way around. "The diplomats informed me that someone here would assist me in finding my way around." Of course, of course. As the gates, smaller than those at the other end of the city that were always opened, a waste of resources, she thought, creaked outward, she couldn't help but notice the ornate design. The metal was cut as if an exoskeleton was reaching out to meet a melded mass of fire and water. A Mancer symbol? She was curious, as dangerous as that was to someone who was not a scout or scientist. about the fleshy red-blooded creatures that could supposedly command the earth around them with their hands. Maybe she would see one. Her thoughts were interrupted by the argument between two beetles, one of them the gatekeeper, and the other a stranger. "It is your diplomatic duty. I told you before what I am going to tell you now. I will decide whether or not to give her the tour when I find out how much she's paying. But I told you, she's from the Queendoms. She probably doesn't have any money. We have an agreement with her government, remember? Do you want another great conquest? Because I don't want to depend on the termites again. The Queenies may be crazy, but they're not going to start a war because I didn't give one of their warriors a free tour." The gatekeeper looked absolutely terrified. She was under the impression that he genuinely believed her people would start a war over this. The very concept was ridiculous. They would only send troops if the city actively stopped her from acquiring the mail. And she wasn't going to report this inconvenience to her superiors as active resistance. Even then, war would depend on how the city reacted to the troops. Luckily, a large red creature that she was ashamed to say she couldn't identify crawled onto the scene. It had a dark red exoskeleton covered in spines, some of the fattest antennae she had ever seen, and, most bizarrely of all, an abdomen that seemed to resemble a fish more than any other Sectans. "What do you want, shellfish?" It was partially the slur and partially the fact that she finally noticed it had 10 legs that made her realize that this thing was crustacean. Crab? No, one of the other types. Lobster? The term is lobster. Oh god, there's that. Yeah, whatever, Pincer. "My tribe is more than..." He composed himself before continuing. "Anyway, I can show the representative from the Queendoms around the city. I am pretty sure she's a soldier of a political duty, not anyone who could sway the Queendoms," the gatekeeper started before the other beetle interrupted. "Hey, it's no chitting off my back if the shellfish wants to show her around. Let him do it. Yeah, we both know why he wants it, but what harm could really come of it?" The gatekeeper glanced back at her, then to the lobster, then to the city before them all, before throwing up his arms in defeat and declaring, "Fine, let the lobster show her some of the important places between prattling on about how the Queendom armies could be useful for his mission." "So, esteemed representative of the Queendoms, what would your name be?" Understanding that names were almost completely disassociated from role in these nonsensical lands, she was less ashamed to say she didn't have one. The lobster seemed flabbergasted for a while, but was then recomposed. "Of course, I won't pretend to understand the intricacies of your culture, but it would feel rude not to call you by your name. What should I call you, so as to satisfy my own ability to honor you?" He had a strange tone. She was convinced that his speech had some sort of goal that wasn't immediately apparent in his words. Maybe it had something to do with the mission the beetles mentioned. At first she was disgusted by the idea, but then remembered that, from his perspective, she was a foreigner. Foreigners, with their questionable motives, were the one thing worth withholding generosity from. "You may grant me a name of your choice, so long as it is not vulgar or offensive. Among my people, the most honorable titles are spoken with sounds of long spines and raging waters. But ants are creatures of the ground, sharpened stingers and raging fires. That is what I will call you, the Lady of Fire, for your people shall burn down everything around them and grow it all anew. It is what you proved in the last great conquests, and it is what you may prove again." The Lady of Fire was a pleasant name. It wasn't a name reserved for a different caste, though it closely resembled some, which, though she would never admit it, actually made it better, and it even took the ever-important "the" into account. She noticed that foreign names ignored this crucial part for whatever reason, probably to distinguish themselves from tools or some other such nonsense, as if all people weren't merely tools of the nations. "I approve." She didn't recognize the lobster's facial expression, but he made her feel uncomfortable. I am glad of that fact. May we begin the tour? Now, the Lady of Fire. Up ahead you may notice the Secton prisons. This is, of course, where criminals from our continent are held. Why would they be held? If they committed a crime, they have proven themselves a traitor to their people and should be executed immediately. Even thieves? Especially thieves. Murderers can sometimes justify their actions with the uselessness of the victim, but thieves have decided that their need is greater than the will of the colony, and such savagery can never be tolerated. The lobster's face took on that odd expression. Your people would have gotten along well with the crabs when they maintained their homeland. You have such great strength, such great honor. If your armies had been there when the fungoid struck, we might still have our homelands. He released a strange sound. I apologize. Just an old crustacean reminiscing on some old stories. Let us continue. The lobster showed the Lady of Fire all sorts of buildings, many of them strange and excessive. She did not understand the purpose of allowing the council to live in a building of precious metal that overlooked everything. How were the leaders supposed to avoid distraction if they were constantly staring at the expanse below them? How could they focus if they were constantly leaving their domiciles and meeting people? The Manser buildings were even worse. While the Lady of Fire understood the importance of symbols, for they allowed one to distinguish important information in a short period of time, she could not for the life of her justify the garish artwork covering the households and buildings of everything owned by a Manser with even the slightest bit of money. Money was another concept she didn't fully grasp. As far as the lobster could explain, it was meant as a way to exchange resources between individuals without the individual's needs getting in the way. When she explained how resources were distributed by the distribution caste, the lobster praised such a selfless and wonderful system. He then went on to explain how his people once had a system that was not entirely different, but unfortunately the fungoids had ruined it. In fact, he mentioned that about a lot of the things she said about her homeland. Obviously he had an angle, but she wasn't entirely sure what it was. Does he want my help with something? The Lady of Fire couldn't think of anything she could possibly do for the lobster, at least not that he would know about beforehand. It occurred to her that a lot of his flattery fell on the queendoms. It wouldn't make sense for him to want something from the queendoms. I am too lowly in the system for words with me to have an impact. So that couldn't be it. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on one's point of view, the Lady of Fire's antenna picked up a message she had never felt before, but knew without a doubt. A fertile male. Excuse me, kind lobster, but I have sensed what I came in the city to search for. She would gladly have taken her leave of the creature if the signal wasn't coming from somewhere behind an impassable barrier of ramshackle buildings. What is the fastest way to get to the other side of this barrier?